Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 2. Du Atwick Aldumil of Achar. The Incident at Hatcher's Mill. Kell froze, uncertain about what was going on. Smiling, he raised a hand at the men standing opposite him. The man out in front of the group clenched his fists. His scowl deepened. Angry muttering came from the back of the group, and the man in front stepped out closer to Kell. He was tall, but not broad like Brandon. His hair, which was blonde with dark roots, hung down around his eyes and curled around his neck. His lips were pulled thin in a frown, and his blue eyes were deep wells of anger. "You're not welcome here, Witcat." Kell flinched. The word the man had spoken cast ripples through Kell's memory. He knew that word. Suddenly he remembered. His hair, his eyes, people's fear and hatred. Witcat. Witch. He inhaled sharply as flashes of memory cascaded through his mind, each punctuated by remembered sounds and smells. Kell reached up and scratched the back of his head, breathed heavily, straining to not cry out from the unexpected torrent of memory flooding through his head. He clenched his eyes shut and braced himself against the wall of the mill. His knees began to buckle as the flashes continued to sear, undiminished through his consciousness. He had been trying the whole day to remember anything about his life that he could, but now he would have given anything to stop the flow of images coursing through his head. Kell snapped his hand over his eyes and covered his face. He was starting to shake. Jupe darted outside and took in the situation with a quick turn of his head. He positioned himself between Kell and the men. "What's going on here, Theod?" His voice had lost the casual, good-natured tone that he had used when talking to Brandon and Kell. In its place, there was a menacing deepness that would have made Kell tremble in other circumstances. Theod stepped closer and pointed at him with an outstretched arm and forefinger. "I told him he wasn't welcome, nothing more. Look at his hair, Jupin. You know what he... What did you do to him?" Jupe cut him off. "He wasn't like this a few moments ago. What did you do?" Theod let his arm drop to his side. "I didn't do anything to him, Hatcher," he sneered. "I merely told him what he was, and he started to shake like a scared child. Look at him." "You spoke to him, didn't you? You imbecile! How could you do that to someone you've never even met before?" As they spoke, the two men were pacing closer and closer to one another. The rest of the men in the group had looked surprised, even nervous, when Jupe had first ran out of the mill. But now that he and Theod were shouting at each other, they looked downright scared, though they were trying to hide it. "Don't you remember what happened the last time one of them came to Rockford?" Theod gestured with his arm wildly towards Kell. He was circling now, maneuvering himself in between Jupe and Kell. Jupe didn't seem to notice. "Yes, I remember, Theod," roared Jupe. "I remember that you accidentally set fire to your house because you were arrogant enough to try to challenge her." Theod's back was now facing Kell, who had slumped to a sitting position at the base of the mill's wall. The pain of his memories were beginning to fade, albeit slightly. At Jupe's remark, Theod's face went crimson. "How dare you! My family burned in that fire. It was started by that silver-haired witch. She was responsible for their deaths." Here, Theod whipped around, seized Kell by the hair, dragged him to his feet, and shook him violently. "And so are you, Witcat!" At the sound of Theod's last shout, which was punctuated by a cruel tug on his hair, the walls that Kell had been building up against the flood of memory crumbled, and a river of pictures, sounds, and smells poured into his mind. The pain that came with it made him scream, unable to fight the grip that Theod had on his hair. Amid the vast sea of memory, an image rushed to Kell's inner eye, an idea, a flicker of will. The back of his mind seemed to open, and there was a sudden rushing sensation followed by a whoosh of air that crammed itself in between his body and Theod's. The pain in his head ceased. The fist that Theod had made in his hair was gone. He opened his eyes and gasped as he took in his surroundings. Theod was sprawled on the ground several yards away. 2 of his companions were trying to help him up. The rest of the men were staring wide-eyed in fear at Kel. Some were beginning to back away. Jupe was standing between him and the men once again, with his hands on his hips. He did not seem at all surprised or afraid, though his body was tense, prepared for something more to happen. One of the men closest to Jupe jolted an arm up and pointed at Kel. "Theod was right! Jupin, you saw what just happened! How can you still protect him?" Jupe spread his hands in defense. "It's not what you think. All he did was—" The man opposite him swiped his hand through the air and shouted, "I know what I saw! Theod was right. He has to be gotten rid of before he kills someone." He reached a hand behind his back and pulled out a knife from his belt. With a sharp cry, he charged toward Kel, who tried to scramble backwards, blocked by the wall of the mill. This was the moment that Jupe had been waiting for. Someone to snap. He stepped in front of the man with the knife, grabbed his outstretched hand. He spun his back into the man's arm, shifted his weight, and threw him over his shoulder onto the ground. Placing a knee between the man's shoulder blades while still holding his hand in an iron grip, he twisted sharply. There was a sickening crack as the man's wrist broke. He screamed and went limp under Jupe's weight, breathing in sharp gasps as he clenched his eyes shut in pain. "All right, that's enough!" shouted Jupe, looking up at the group of men who by this time had propped up Theod between 2 of them and were nervously watching Jupe, shocked by his quick and brutal action. With one hand, Jupe held the fallen man in place under his leg. With the other, he grabbed the knife off the ground where it had fallen, pointing it angrily toward the mob. "You are all on my land, my property," he growled. "You attacked an innocent man and attempted to kill him. You will answer to the council for this. Whether or not you are able to stand when you are called before them is your choice. Now get out of my sight and off my land before I change my mind about letting you leave in one piece." As the last of his words echoed off into the trees, he released the arm of the man he had pinned to the ground. With a yelp, the man scrambled to his feet and staggered over to the group, cradling his arm against his chest. Slowly, the men began to back away. First 1, then 2, then the rest of them turned and retreated down the path that led back into town. As they disappeared down the road, Jupe turned to Kel and tossed the knife to him. It landed at his feet with a thud. "I think George wanted you to have this." They stared at each other for a moment, and Kel started to chuckle. They both began to laugh. Jupe grabbed Kel's hand and pulled him to his feet. "I'm sorry about that. The people of Rockford aren't all like that, you know." He dusted off the back of Kel's shirt. "I know," said Kel, as he dusted off his trousers, sending dirt and flour into the air. "I suppose I should thank you for saving my life. I think he would have killed me." Jupe became serious, the laughter draining from his eyes as he gazed off into the trees. "You're right, I suppose. He would have. In small towns like Rockford, rumors spread like rot unless they are stopped immediately. If I hadn't broke George's wrist, he wouldn't have let it go. He needed to know there were consequences for such reckless behavior. I don't want Rockford to become a place like South Harbor, ruled by the whims of a superstitious mob." Silence hung in the air as they both contemplated what had just transpired. "Rockford isn't a safe place for travelers anymore," spoke Jupe at last. "Which makes it all the more important that you stay at my farm while you're in town. Come on." He slapped Kel on the shoulder. "We have work to do still before the day is done. Let's get the flour loaded into the cart and be off, just in case they decide to return." Kel moved to hand Jupe the knife, but Jupe shook his head and pushed it back. "You better hang on to that. You may need it. Don't think George will insist you give it back to him. I'll get you a sheath for it when we get back to my home." Kel grunted and stuck the knife behind his belt. "What do we have left to do then?" he asked, rubbing his hands together. Jupe answered him, disappearing into the mill. "We still need to drop this flour off at the baker's before we head home. After that, we should sharpen some of the tools that we will use tomorrow morning." He re-emerged from the mill carrying a bag of flour under each arm, wincing at each step. "I think I hurt my back again when I, subdued George earlier." Kel trotted inside and grabbed the last of the 2 bags, and returned outside to see Jupe arranging the first 2 on the bed of the cart. Kel heaved the flour sacks into the back with the rest of them, went around the front of the cart. Jupe already had climbed up into the seat, and was arranging the reins in his hands. When Kel had clambered up after him, he whistled at Bear, and the car lurched forward along the road into town. "Who owns the bakery?" asked Kel after a moment. Jupe barked a laugh. "George does." The cart rattled down the roadway back into Rockford. The smells of autumn hung in the warm air, and the songs of birds calling at one another drifted through the trees. Gray squirrels frantically collected fallen walnuts from the bases of the yellowing trees that lined the road. Winter was on its way. Bear plodded along ahead, pulling the cart behind him, obviously dismayed at being harnessed to the cart once again. Every few minutes, Jupe would speak words of encouragement to him when he showed signs of slowing. "This is Mayor Bradley's land," offered Jupe, motioning around them at the trees. "The King's Road runs through them all the way to Rockford." Kel gazed around them at the grove of trees. Falling walnuts sporadically broke the silence in the forest. "Does he tend to the trees?" asked Kel, still looking off into the foliage. "He used to," sighed Jupe, "though in recent years he hasn't been able to hire enough help to gather the nuts from the entirety of his land. Now he just collects those that are nearest his house. It's a pity, really. People leave Rockford when it needs them the most because they don't want to deal with the hardships of the dry years." Kel looked over at him. "Why are there dry years? What happens?" Jupe cleared his throat. "It's different every time it happens. A skirmish here, an uprising there, a drought over there." He paused again. "It rarely has anything to do with things happening near Rockford. Odd things happening around the Northlands trickle down the stream and affect certain other things. Usually isn't all that bad, but some years it's worse than normal." "How's this year?" asked Kel. "This year isn't bad, but our regular influx of seasonal hired hands didn't come this year. For some reason or another, no traveling workers came through town, and neither did any traders for that matter, save old Joe." Jupe gritted his teeth as he thought about his words. Kel scratched the back of his head before asking curiously, "What do you think is causing it?" Jupe ran his tongue across the front of his teeth and thought, "Well, can't be sure, but last time something similar happened, tensions between the kingdom and the old bloods in the east were rising. Almost led to an all-out war. Traveling workers were either conscripted or joined up of their own accord following the promises of riches and glory. The traders followed the army around instead of heading into the outlying towns and villages such as Rockford. The following years were just as bad, if not worse, than they are now. Only time will tell, really. Since no traders came with news, Rockford is fairly cut off from the goings-on of the kingdom. For all I know, there could be a war in the making. We probably won't know until the king's marshals come through town looking for recruits." "Does anyone ever sign up?" asked Kel. "It doesn't seem that Rockford has a surplus of bored young men looking for fights. Well, not young men, anyway." Jupe smiled out of the side of his mouth. "You're right, of course. Rockford isn't as big as it used to be. In fact, it's been growing smaller each year. Usually no person with a brain in their head will sign up when the marshal comes through. But occasionally some young boy will get it in his mind that he wants to be a hero from the stories. Of course, the marshal doesn't discourage these kinds of fantasies. It's bad for his business." "Business?" piped Kel. Jupe nodded his head grimly. "Business. The marshal gets paid a sort of commission. The more soldiers he musters, the more he gets paid. It's a little encouragement on behalf of the king. Depending on who the marshal is, sometimes our boys aren't even given a choice." Kel found himself nodding. He remembered something like that happening before. Some vague place in him found that concept painfully familiar. There was an uncomfortable silence as Jupe stared off ahead. The cart bounced on a rough patch in the road. Jupe jolted out of his hushed state. But, like I said, there's no telling whether or not that's what's happening. For all we know, some wealthy landowner bought up all the workers, and the traders simply took a different route than they normally do, running out of goods before they reached Rockford. Cal could tell by the look in his eyes that he didn't find this explanation very probable, worry mixed with apprehension. "That's part of the reason I offered you work. While my back does have something to do with it, I mostly just needed an extra hand. I usually hire a worker to help me on the farm during harvest time. 2 if the year is good. This was a plentiful year, but no workers came." Cal smiled. "So what you're saying is that tomorrow we have a lot of work to get done." Jupe chuckled. "That's exactly what I'm saying." They rode along in a comfortable quietness for a few minutes, enjoying the smells and sounds of the forest around them. "You said that you own that mill?" asked Kel after a while. Buildings were beginning to appear on all sides of the lane, and the road was steadily becoming more even. Jupe nodded his head, still looking forward. "Ugh, that I do. What are you thinking?" He turned his head and looked at Kel. "Well," began Kel, "I was just curious why the baker, George, doesn't own it. Wouldn't it make more sense for him to buy it from you and grind his own grain into flour? How did you come across it? Did you build it?" The cart jerked over a chunk of brick sticking out of the roadway. Jupe smiled to himself and turned back to the road. They were now rolling down a street into the shopping district in town. "That is an interesting story for sure," grinned Jupe. "The mill is actually on Mayor Bradley's land. Used to be his land. Belongs to me now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It used to belong to George. He had purchased the land from the mayor when he first came to Rockford. He needed land near the Morgan to build a watermill for his grain. In fact, it used to be that I would pay him to grind my grain into flour. He would subtract the price from his payment when I sold him the finished flour after he ground it. A few years back, Rockford was going through a rough time. For some reason, George was hit the hardest. He wasn't exactly the best at managing his marks. It was fairly common knowledge that he lost quite a bit when the traders would come through town. I offered to buy the mill from him, and he accepted. Now I'm the only farmer in Rockford and the surrounding county that owns his very own watermill. It cost me a small fortune, but being able to grind my own grain and the grain of other farmers more than pays up for the loss. Jupe laughed. George has tried to buy it back from me several times since, but I've turned him down each time. I'll never give up that mill, not if I can at all help it. He looked up. Here we are. Give me a hand, will you? We'll just leave the flour around back. George is probably across town at Abigail's place getting his wrists set. Abigail's the herbalist in Rockford, the best healer for miles around. The cart rolled to a stop in front of the bakery. They both dismounted and grabbed the sacks of flour. Kel followed Jupe as he shouldered open a gate and stepped into a small courtyard behind the building. They dropped the flour on the doorstep and headed back out to the cart. Taking the cart down a side street to get it turned around, they headed back the way they had come. "Where's your farm, Jupe?" asked Kel. Jupe gestured down the road with an arm. It's across the Morgan on the western bank. Most of the farms are on that side. When the Morgan overflows in the springtime, it generally floods that side of the river, which washes all the sediment from upriver onto the farmable land. The first people to farm here took plots of land on the banks of the Morgan. Everyone else simply followed suit. East of the Morgan, you have the town of Rockford and most of its citizens. West of the Morgan, you have the county of Rockford and most of the farmers. My farm is nearer the Morgan than most of the other farms, but not quite close enough to reap any of the benefits of the flooding river. They rode in silence until they reached the mill, and then turned down the dirt path that Kel had taken earlier that day from the bridge. The cart bumped over rocks and roots as it rolled along. Bear's ears twitched as they neared the Morgan, and the sound of running water reached them. They turned right at the forked road and onto the stone bridge across the flowing river. As they reached the western bank, and as the cart tumbled off the bridge, a pleasant breeze blew in their faces from the trees, bringing with it the scent of the forest understory. Jupe closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. A smile spread across his lips. "This is my favorite time of year," he mused. The cart rolled onward. Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. But in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.